Welcome, everybody. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Adalsteinn Brown, but we're going to call him Steini, like everybody, one of the most influential voices in evidence-informed health policy. Steini is the Dean of the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, my alma mater, and his career has spanned senior leadership roles in government, academia, healthcare strategy, etc. His work has focused on bridging the gap between research and real-world decision-making, ensuring that policy is not just informed by evidence, but actually implemented effectively. In this conversation, we're going to be tackling how we move beyond just generating evidence and actually getting policymakers to use it. Thank you, Steini, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started. We know that evidence-informed policy is often framed as the gold standard, and we see persistent gaps between researchers and real-world decision-making. We've invested well over a decade, if not 2 decades, of research and effort to try and bridge this gap. Why do you think it's stuck where it is, or what do you think is the biggest failure to try and push forward evidence-informed policymaking?
So I think biggest challenge. I think the biggest challenge is that we forget the context, right? We forget sort of the context in which information is supposed to change hands. We forget about things like trust. I think for a long time we've had this idea that if we find a better way to generate evidence, we've got a much better chance that evidence getting into practice or getting into policy. And I think that's true. I think we can still improve the ways that we work to kind of create evidence or co-create evidence with decision makers. But there's always going to be these fundamental misalignments. Someone needs an answer tomorrow, and you need a month to come up with a good answer. Or someone needs an answer to a particular question, but as it works its way through a legislature, or as it works its way through a policy process or a cabinet table, the question changes. And we're not able to change research like that to change the question halfway through. You'd never get through your ethics committee. You'd always worry about the bias you're introducing into this, and you might not even be able to physically sort of pivot the research in that way. So there's always these fundamental disconnects. So I think the biggest challenge we face is that we forget some of this context, and I think we forget that the critical element that we have to build in around knowledge transfer is trust. And trust is only going to happen with regular interactions. It's only going to happen through consistency. And that's not a regular interaction that is, let me tell you what you need to do differently, or let me tell you what you need to do better, or let me tell you what I think. A lot of it is actually listening and engaging. And I think that's a really big challenge because we forget that. We get down into the work because that's, sometimes the most exciting stuff. And that's what we're trained to do, right? But I think it's also challenging because it's not anything that's recognized or rewarded in most research institutes and most universities. If you are a junior scholar and you wander off to spend some time talking in government, or actually took a placement or a secondment into government, or provide help off the side of your desk, that's not anything that adds up into the paper count, at least not early on, or into the grant count. It's other stuff, and we haven't figured out how to value that. So I think that recognition of the context and the investment to navigate that context well is the biggest challenge that we face.
So if we had to make, all changes baby steps, if we had to make one change to try and tackle that challenge, what would you suggest?
So it's a little bit hard to suggest one change. I think there's probably an important change in how we train people. And I think there's an important change in how we look at careers a little bit differently. Let me talk first about how we train people. For the last 4 or 5 years, a group of us across the country have been working on what we call kind of training modernization. This idea that, what do you teach a doctoral student that really helps them have the impact they want to have? And this all comes out of a series of conversations that some of us had. And I was struck one day by this particular pointed conversation where I was talking with one of our grads, who's now a very senior decision maker in government. He's really deeply trained, quantitatively oriented. He's exactly the type of champion for evidence-based policy that you want. And his PhD, he has a PhD. And we're talking about the students of ours he was hiring and how he's working with them. And he said, oh, they're incredibly smart. They're incredibly hardworking. But it takes a while for them to figure out kind of how to slot into this role of, working within government, of understanding the pressures that we face, of understanding the challenges, of even learning some of the language. and fundamentally of learning how to work within teams and when to lead and when to follow. And I think it was the very same day I was talking to one of our grads who was actually working in this person's unit. And I said, so, how's it going? And they said, oh, I'm really grateful for my education. I really learned a lot, but I'm not having the impact that I want to have. And it was two sides of the same coin that we're training people with this deep, deep, deep disciplinary set of tools. We're not giving them these skills always around communication or around project management or around policy or around even networking, these sorts of things that would allow them to deploy that incredible intellectual arsenal that they've developed. And we're lucky that a lot of these people are just so smart that they kind of pick it up or they kind of figure it out. But I think there's a big change in the training that we need to give people. I mean, I think we just released our second version of these competencies. They're out publicly, and we're trying to figure out now how we put education in these competencies within reach of every sort of research student. So I think there's something on the training. I think there's something as well about how we think about careers. And if you look at some of the people who've been most influential in other disciplines, they're kind of boundary spanners, right? They spent some time in academia, but they've spent some time in government. Or they've spent some time, like you spent some time in the private sector, right? You actually pick up different ways of working, different languages, different ways of making sense of the challenges and how people perceive those challenges. And I think we need to figure out a way to kind of welcome that type of diversity into career rather than what we do now, which is very focused on how many papers can you get out, how many dollars can you win in grants, rather than how do you make sure that you're having impact? And I recognize that big question is really hard to measure. Lots of people spend a lot of time thinking about impact and what it is and all the challenges in measuring that. But I think we could make at least a little step by trying to figure out, career paths that come in and out of the academy and really bring that type of experience, which, fundamentally at the end of the day can't really be fully taught in a classroom or through some type of module or set of activities.
I have so many ideas rolling through meaning we could do co-ops, we could do placements.
Yeah.
I recently introduced in a different program I'm running a power skills course, which is all about, what skills, the networking, that with us, it's fundraising, what are the actual skills you need to succeed? Not the theories. The theories are important, but what are the skills that are going to get you there?
Right. And at the end of the day, it has to have an experiential component, right?
Right.
At the end of these sorts of things, they're kind of like surgery. You'd never want to get an operation from the person who learned surgery out of a book, right? You want the person who's been standing beside the really good surgeon. You want the person who spent, years of their life kind of perfecting their craft, watching and being coached by others and, being reflective about what they're doing and have that experience. There's a reason why, they're hard to acquire, but so valuable when you've got them.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of what you're saying in terms of they don't understand and it's two sides of the same coin, brings us back to the decades old two communities theory, right? How they speak different languages and it's frustrating because we're decades later and we're still facing the same problem.
We are. And sometimes I think, I contrast what I think are sort of very interesting approaches to knowledge transfer. You can look at something like C.P. Snow's Science and Government, where he kind of talks about how good decisions and bad decisions were made at a period of incredible crisis, incredible challenge. And a lot of it is about how you set yourself up in a team. A lot of it is about how you get clarity on what you're trying to achieve. A lot of it is how you, keep focus, about how you maintain, a certain set of principles. It's less around, here's this framework for knowledge transfer, or, here's this sort of approach to, communicating stuff. All those tools can help, but there's a lot of very fundamental stuff that, I think is really quite powerful if people get a chance to grasp it in their own kind of practice.
So you had mentioned numerous times in terms of getting the experience and building the relationship, etc. So hypothetically, I'm a young doctoral student or a young master's student, and I work in such and such hospital. How am I going to go about getting that exposure to the different policymakers and decision makers?
Sure. So I think one of which is to kind of seek out environments and people from whom you're going to learn. One of the best pieces of advice I got from one of the first people I worked for, was to always make sure there was someone I was learning from. It wasn't, a context or that I'd learned from or being around a bunch of smart people. It was actually making choices based on where someone's going to help you learn things. And he sort of said, even if you're, this exalted role, are you going to learn from the prime minister? Are you going to learn from the president? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not a satisfying role at the end of the day. You've got to be in this place where you're constantly developing and learning. So part of the advice I give is, make decisions based on how you're going to learn. Don't make decisions on what you think the normal career path is. Um, Second, I'd probably say, even if you kind of deviate out of the academy, find a way to keep a foot in. And so when I was, actually, I think, during some of the period where we worked together, I was mostly in government, but I kept on working with students and I kept on teaching. In part because it grounds you. You can get one of these great roles. I had a lovely role being kind of the head of strategy and policy for the Ministry of Health in Ontario. And it's a hierarchical environment. You get lots of respect. You get lots of opportunities to do things. People can be differential, except students aren't. Or when you're working with a person who's doing a really interesting PhD, they know more than you do, and it's clear you have to keep up, right? So those sorts of things are really good just to kind of continue that sort of intellectual development. They're also good because it keeps a presence that's real. And I'm talking about engaged. I'm not talking about having an appointment. I'm talking about being engaged. It keeps a presence that's real, and then it's easier to kind of slide in and out of that sort of environment. People understand you. We should never forget that, there's some truth to the whole ivory tower idea. They are hard to get into, but if people understand the value and understand where you're coming from, it's easier to kind of move in and out of those environments. So I'd probably say, think about who you're going to learn from. That'd be the first piece of advice. That's going to take you probably outside of the academy at times. Find ways to keep a foot in. It even just needs to be the local place, right? It doesn't have to be the place you started or the place you want to end up. It can be the local place. But make sure it's a real genuine engagement. And I guess the third thing I'd say, and it sounds like the too vanilla or bland or kind of high level piece of advice, but I'd say you are going to have to take some risks. They should always be calculated risks. You look at really good entrepreneurs, they think a lot about risk. They don't just do things wildly. I'm not suggesting that. But really, what is the potential reward out of a new role or a new post that's going to help you develop? And I started in the private sector, came back to the university, took a big pay cut, was about to, go out for tenure, left the university, went into government, came back. It's been one of these places where it's really helped me develop. And although it may look like a series of really bad decisions in terms of advancing my career, they've been really satisfying decisions in terms of kind of my own development and my own ability to get things done.
But it's not the norm what you've done in terms of, right? I don't think I know anyone else that has gone back and forth at such critical junctures of their career.
I think you see it more in the US. And honestly, I think you see it at really, truly elite institutions. People get drawn in to help with problems. They get drawn in to kind of help figure things out. And the more that the institution can kind of figure out how to make that work, or the more they're willing to kind of take the risk and not worry about, coming back to exactly the same spot. I think you see places that have people and have policies where that's a little more common.
Okay. So let's talk. I just have a few questions about your experience and what you've done probably when you were in government, but you've
Yeah.
implemented many changes to support evidence-informed policymaking. What's the one that you're the most proud of or that you think has had the most impact?
So there's lots of things I'm proud of. They've always been the result of a team. So I'd say, in each case, I'm kind of proud of being part of the team that got this or that done. Maybe if it's okay, I'd talk about two things of which I'm particularly proud. The first is encapsulated or summarized in an article that Jonathan Lomas and I wrote, I think 2010 or 2011 for the Millbank Quarterly. And it was this idea of how we try to increase within government the use of evidence. And it talks about some of the simple things we did about, kind of making people accountable for using evidence. It talks about some of the things we did to enable things, really um, uh, creating a poll for evidence, creating some skills, having people, like John Lavis came in and trained, I think almost every one of our people, which was great. It really built up some capacity and fluency, which is really critical. And it talks about some very hard decisions that, with evidence, really kind of a range of evidence. Governments made some very hard decisions, but we're confident enough to kind of progress in them. So I think, that's something I'm really proud of. Part because it kind of shows it could be done. I will say we were really lucky though when we were in government, we were able to bring in people like Jonathan Lomas, like John Lavis, who would either come in, for a period of time or kind of in a episodic way. And that really, that presence, I think both is interesting for them and sensitizes them to what's going on, but it actually helps everyone up their game. So that's one of the things I'm really proud of. Second thing I'm proud of is probably the Excellent Care for All Act. And it's kind of an interesting story. It's a piece of legislation that's relatively slim, but it talks about how we want to improve quality or how we think we can improve quality at sort of the system level. Doesn't do a lot. Talks a little bit about board roles, talks a little bit about compensation, talks a little bit about enabling it. But it was initially a much longer proposal of work. It was initially, I think, probably 40, 50 pages of potential legislation and regulation. And I could say very proudly that it was the best possible synthesis or summary of the evidence that we had to date. And it went nowhere. But what we were smart enough, I guess, or maybe it's just a lucky accident, we kind of tore it all down and we engaged a broad sector of folks, not just decision makers, but a broad swath of people, who have some role or another in our health system. And together, that co-creation, really kind of re-looking at the evidence, trying to think about what's feasible, led to a much slimmer, much smaller act. Led to, I think, something that at the end of the day has been more effective. Led to something where it was, I won't say it was easy, it was a very brave thing, but a minister could make a decision about what they wanted to do that wasn't on the agenda, that wasn't responding to a crisis. It was just good policy. And when they had that ability to look at evidence and look at the support around the evidence, they made, hard decisions quickly and implemented, really pretty well. So, I think understanding that it's not just about creating this great synthesis, you don't want the 80-page summary, but understanding that evidence can be the start of a process of developing really effective policy was what was really, I think, kind of like a real exciting moment for me and taught me a lot that, wasn't in any of the frameworks at that point.
Okay. So we're at time, but I just want to finish with one brief question. If you could envision, what would the ideal evidence-informed policymaking infrastructure look like? Or what would change mean to you in this world? Because realistically, we can't expect, there's so much else influencing policy, et cetera. So we can't expect that every policy is going to be informed, or it could be informed, but not based on the best available research. So in an ideal world, what would it look like for you?
Well, and I'll be really provocative, nor should it be based on the best available evidence. Governments are not elected to implement evidence. Governments are elected to reflect the values or the goals or, the aspirations of the people who vote for them. That's not always aligned with the evidence. And as hard as that may be for a scientist, that's kind of the way it is. So what would the best possible system look like? I think the best possible system would have a few key characteristics. I think you'd see a lot more open policy, a lot more white papers, a lot more discussion, a lot more critique. There used to be this sort of process by which governments would develop ideas, and there might be a contest of those ideas, but it was a genuine engagement and debate. It wasn't a 140 character response to something. It wasn't a focus group evaluation. It was a real thorough, thoughtful kind of examination of an important question. And it was often done in public. The whole idea of having discussion papers is a maybe not an exciting thing, but it's a public-facing thing that engages. So I think it's open, engaging a lot of brains. It's pretty common sense. I think you'd see researchers having a little different posture. It would be less about pushing an idea, probably more about letting good ideas be pulled in and trying to figure out how to respond to those pulls. I think you would see a lot more open data. As scientists, a lot of us really rely on data. And data is the only asset that gets more valuable the more you use it, right? So, you got to think about actually shepherding these things well and creating sort of common, bigger data platforms. And finally, I think you'd see something where evaluation and improvement, this whole sort of how, policy could fit into a learning health system idea, that was kind of secondhand. Whether it was commonplace because of report cards or scorecards that brought forward those evaluations, in a standard way, or whether it was kind of focused, but still kind of looking at it and providing constructive advice back on how to improve because of policy drift, policy layering, the inevitable compromises that have to happen around a lot of pieces of policy. You need to kind of constantly evaluate them, see how they're going, and that I think would sort of what an ideal system might look like.
Okay. Steini, thank you so much. You mentioned a lot of interesting concepts that we will link to in the notes and your paper with John Loomis. I feel like I could talk to you for an hour, but I mean, I know I could talk to you for an hour, but maybe we'll loop back next round and have another 15-minute, which actually turned into, 20 minutes of a podcast with you at some point. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Moriah. Congratulations on the podcast and everything else.
Thanks.